welcome to this talk called Sketching Anxiety, Lexicogrammatical Patterns Used to Discuss Anxiety in an Online Support Forum, prepared by me, Dr. Luke Collins, and my colleague, Professor Paul Baker. This talk is a reflection of work that we've been doing investigating how people talk about anxiety in an online forum. We're going to be using the word sketch tool, through which we examine the collocational patterns of anxiety according to grammatical relations. And we've identified contrasting discourses to conceptualize and relate the experiences of anxiety disorders that we've seen on that forum. We're going to consider how discussions of anxiety compare with related terms like depression, fear, and stress. With respect to anxiety disorders, we're talking about a range of conditions that are collectively characterized by excessive fear and anxiety correlated with behavioral alterations. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, concepts of fear and anxiety are very closely related, but they do provide this distinction. Fear is the emotional response to real or perceived imminent threat, whereas anxiety is anticipation of future threat. They state that obviously these two states overlap, but they also differ, with fear more often associated with surges of autonomic arousal necessary for fight or flight, thoughts of immediate danger, and escape behaviours, and anxiety more often associated with muscle tension and vigilance in preparation for future danger and cautious or avoidant behaviours. So one of the key things here is the physical symptom manifestation of anxiety. And clinical judgment is also required in order to determine what is excessive fear. With respect to types of anxiety disorders, they are typically categorized based on the source of the anxiety, what it is that's triggering this fear response. So you get descriptions of generalized anxiety disorder caused by everyday events, social anxiety disorder caused by social interactions, panic disorder, which manifests as sudden attacks of fear or anxiety, and agoraphobia, so anxiety that arises from a concern about being in a situation or place from which it might be difficult or embarrassing to escape. One of the difficulties with identifying and diagnosing anxiety disorders is that each anxiety disorder is diagnosed only when the symptoms are not attributable to the physiological effects of a substance or medication or other medical condition, or are not better explained by another mental disorder. There is an understanding that rates of anxiety disorders are conservative, since it's very difficult to identify and report. Nevertheless, the World Health Organization does report that an estimated 264 million people around the world experience anxiety disorders. It's also the case that anxiety disorders are highly comorbid with depressive and bipolar disorders. In the section on anxiety disorders in the DSM, it's acknowledged that the boundaries between disorders are more porous than originally perceived. Ultimately, it can be extremely difficult not only to describe anxiety and depression independently, but also to recognize their co-occurrence in the first place. We've also seen in other areas of health that lay descriptions, such as those found in online support groups, shape others' understandings of the experience. So it gives us a rationale for looking at online forum discussions and potentially looking for ways in which those with lived experience make distinctions between these disorders or offer a more illustrative description of what they're like. Our data come from Health Unlocked, which describes itself as the world's largest social network for health. It hosts over 300 communities focusing on specific health concerns, and anxiety support is the largest community relating to anxiety disorders. And this is the forum from which we've taken our data. The data includes posts from between the 20th of March 2012 and September 2020. It's approximately 21 million words, and there are over 17,000 different contributors to the forum. These participants are located around the world, but the vast majority come from the UK and the US. One of the things that we wanted to investigate in our exploration of anxiety are its distinctions in relations to other related terms, and collocation analysis can help us to make visible the differences in the patterns for how seemingly related words are used. So we used the sketch engine thesaurus to identify potential synonymous words, and the thesaurus function in Sketch Engine does that on the basis of words that keep similar collocations. So using the English Web 2020 corpus, we identified the following synonymous words for anxiety, which are based on their collocational profile. Words like depression, worry, fear, emotion, stress, anger, confusion, frustration, grief, and illness. So on the basis of a general web corpus, these are words that have been shown to behave in a similar way to anxiety. What we then wanted to do was to compare how these words are used in our more specialized anxiety support forum to see how those related terms might be distinguished by people with lived experience. Collocational profiles are developed from the word sketch tool, and what the word sketch does is identify words which commonly occur with the search term according to particular grammatical relationships. So using these formulations such as nouns modified by the search term, verbs with search term as the subject, etc. So you can see in this visualization here, in this kind of lime green section, this actually represents the formulation verbs with anxiety as the object. So you can see the verb suffer, so suffering with anxiety, experiencing anxiety, related to anxiety, etc. So what we're going to talk through are our observations of those collocational profiles and how these can be summarized in terms of particular discourses. There were nearly 147,000 instances of anxiety in the data. So based on collocates identified through word sketch formulations, we're going to discuss the following themes: medicalizing versus normalizing discourse, catastrophizing versus minimizing, anthropomorphizing and abstracting, and owning and distancing. These indicate how anxiety in our data is discursively constructed. So beginning with our medicalizing discourse, you can see here the words that complete the formulations that came through our word sketch profile. And the verbs here do lend themselves to this kind of medicalizing discourse, so treating, curing, and diagnosing. Indeed, having a particular condition is a fairly common way of talking about medical conditions. In descriptions of what anxiety is, it's described as an illness, a condition, a disorder, a disease. Anxiety is a pre-modifier for similar terms: disorder, anxiety condition, anxiety diagnosis. People describe themselves as anxiety sufferers. They go and see their anxiety therapist, and they take medication. And in the category at the bottom, we do see this more kind of person-first approach. So people with anxiety, a person with anxiety, or a patient with anxiety. So that again explicitly marks the person as operating in the kind of medical domain. In comparison, we have a more normalizing discourse, looking perhaps to downplay the medical status of anxiety. So anxiety is described as normal. There are a few instances of people saying anxiety is not a disease, not an illness, or not a disorder. But you can see from the numbers there that these are far fewer than examples where people are saying it's an illness. And then we get these descriptions of an anxiety thing, this anxiety stuff, this anxiety crap. These very vague descriptions, again, perhaps working to downplay what anxiety is. What we do get on the forum is lots of demonstrations of how severe or how extreme experience of anxiety are. This kind of catastrophizing discourse. In terms of duration, it's constant, chronic, and daily. And then you get these negative evaluations: bad, terrible, and horrible. Crippling as well, which is actually quite literal. In the moment, anxiety is described as an attack. It's something that you suffer. Anxiety can be heightened, worsened, and raised. And perhaps relating to those physical symptoms that manifest, that distinguish anxiety from fear, descriptions of anxiety do have this physical metaphorical discourse. So kicking and hitting, it can also strike and flare up other emotional and physical reactions. In contrast, there is some minimizing discourse. So this is usually comparative to another scenario where it was much worse. So the anxiety is less, it's mild, it's little, it's low. There is some degree of normalizing here where it's just good old anxiety, or it's just anxiety, it's plain anxiety, it's classic anxiety. And this contributes to discussions where people are looking to diagnose or identify anxiety disorders. So in instances where participants in the forum come to get confirmation of a suspected anxiety disorder diagnosis. Others may respond by saying, yes, that's classic anxiety. That's what you have. Anxiety is described as manageable, as common, as mild, and not harmful, not bad, not threatening. But again, the instances of these are far fewer in comparison to the catastrophizing discourse. And in terms of being manageable, the verbs associated with anxiety involve helping with anxiety, overcoming anxiety, accepting anxiety. So it is described as something that can be managed, manipulated, controlled by the person. And there are pursuits to dealing with anxiety, living with anxiety, and coping with anxiety. So those descriptions offer a more kind of optimistic reality where a person can go about their lives even with this anxiety disorder. What we tend to find is that the catastrophizing discourses are very much in the advice-seeking posts. So very often this is the first post in the discussion thread, as participants are motivated to go to the forum because their anxiety is so severe, and the responses that they get might then try to make the person feel better, might try and minimize the situation by saying it is minimal or it is manageable, that there are ways in which you can get a handle on this. We did find a curious anthropomorphizing discourse where anxiety is described as a bully, a monster, a demon, a beast. And here is where anxiety is given its own agency, its own kind of designs, its wants, and its ways of manipulating the participant. And in that kind of personification, it's then described as something that's separate from the individual. With this agency, anxiety has the capacity to cause things, to make things happen, to affect things. It has the capacity to bring about things, to control things. And again, this puts the speaker in the position of being in some kind of fight or battle with an opponent. And then on the other hand, you get these more abstracted descriptions of anxiety. So it's this thing, it's a state, it's a journey, it's an experience. So not so much described as an individual or a person or a body with agency, and something more abstract. And with it being a state, it's then described as something that is experienced. We found a few descriptions of people owning their anxiety, which is partly to do with the way in which it manifests. These are quite personalized experiences. So it might be a way of differentiating, well, this is how my anxiety manifested, which might be slightly different from the way in which you've experienced it. Nevertheless, in that ownership, it is described as being part of the self. So the most common kind of colloquy in that category was my. There are then some less frequent references to a shared experience in talking about our anxiety. That ownership is further demonstrated in its possession or occupation of the brain or the mind, which again are described as something quite personal. And in those person-first descriptions, people with anxiety, I'm a person with anxiety, there is that sense of ownership. And in descriptions of other conditions like depression, the stage of ownership is often linked to a case of acceptance or recovery. So there may be more promising signs here that the participants are accepting of their anxiety. And then in contrast to that, you get these indeterminate descriptions of anxiety. So the anxiety or this anxiety, which are not personalized as much. And in this category, I would also refer back to those anthropomorphizing descriptions where anxiety is described as something outside of the body. So presented as another person or as another body or as another entity with agency, which the participant is then in some kind of conflict with. Just to highlight where these descriptions are appearing, that ownership and the description of first-person anxiety, my anxiety, are much more frequent in initial posts. Typically, as participants introduce themselves, they talk about their history with anxiety, and they talk about the particular triggers or manifestations or symptoms of anxiety, which again can serve to facilitate a discussion where they're actually identifying, is this anxiety disorder? In follow-up posts, i.e. the replies that that person receives, participants are more likely to adopt that as a topic of discussion. So they return and talk about your anxiety or the anxiety So much less frequently talking about my anxiety, nevertheless, there will be a kind of reciprocity in people offering their own experiences and their own stories. Turning our attention to anxiety and the related terms, we have the frequencies here for the related terms that we identified from the thesaurus function in Sketch Engine. One of the issues with looking for the distinctions between these terms is that so often participants in the forum would kind of list them together. So anxiety, depression, and OCD, anxiety, depression, and other related illnesses. Now, this may indicate that members of the forum themselves have difficulty distinguishing anxiety from depression, and that they might find it more useful to kind of lump all those together. Nevertheless, we pursued this investigation in order to see if there were examples of how participants might, on the one hand, talk about anxiety and then distinguish that from experiences of depression. Sketch Engine provides a useful visualization of a direct comparison of the word sketches. So at the left end of this spectrum, you've got depression, and at the right end, you've got anxiety. The words that appear towards one end indicate that they have a stronger association. So the most distinct terms used in relation to depression and in relation to anxiety are typically words that specify a type of that condition. So you get postnatal depression, you get health anxiety. It's more typical to talk about clinical levels of depression rather than clinical levels of anxiety. And that again might point to the difficulties with identifying that threshold for excessive fear and anxiety. In the middle of this visualization, you get a series of words which are equally associated with depression and anxiety. So they're both talked about as being severe, major, but then conversely mild. Just to summarize our observations of where we did find potential distinctions between these related terms. So one of the more common ways of describing depression is through this metaphor of descent. So contributors talk about sinking into depression, falling into depression. They have deep depression, and they talk about feeling low in relation to depression. And this is a wider metaphorical use that has been observed in other works. This is a fairly common way of talking about depression, but it does contrast with the way that the other emotional terms and anxiety are discussed in terms of ascent. So levels of anxiety reaching sky high, going through the roof, being heightened and raised. We found that the terms anger, confusion, frustration, and grief were not typically suffered in the same way as anxiety, illness, and depression are. So this is where there might be a distinction between talking about what are accepted as emotional terms and what are talked about in terms of illnesses. Compared with depression, we observed more evidence for anxiety as an attack and thereby something to be fought. And this might speak to the kind of acuteness of the experience of anxiety, how it comes on very quickly and has and manifests in these physical symptoms. Like anxiety, fear is also described as an enemy, characterized as the biggest enemy, your worst enemy, your arch enemy, and then subsequently something that members battle, or that there are scenarios that feed that fear or feed anxiety. So to close, our analysis showed a wide range of different ways that people on the Anxiety Support Forum could linguistically represent anxiety, so as a medical condition or as something more ordinary, as terrible or slight, as living or abstract, and as part of a person or separate from them. These representations did overlap to different degrees, so referring to anxiety as a living entity would also imply that it's separate from the person who experiences it. And what we're hoping for is that these representations could provide medical practitioners and people who experience anxiety options for seeking alignment in how they discuss those experiences. So when they're talking about them, how they find a common ground or a common language through which to relate to others who might have similar experiences and be able to offer advice. Thank you for listening. We welcome comments and questions.